And just by way of background, we've been looking over the last 24 months or so at the potential value of emergency department records as a source of surveillance on the health of workers, specifically work-related injury and LIN, perhaps, episodes of illness. Our presentation, today is looking at the way in which two data sources, workers' compensation claim data and emergency department data, converge and diverge in their portraits of the health of workers on a regional basis in Ontario. There's a number of features of this work that have led us to have to push ourselves into some new areas. For example, I don't think our organization has had an estimate of the insured labor force of Ontario. This is the WSIB insured labor force by region, by geographic region, before we tried to bring that forward in terms of implementing the methods in this project. So my colleague, Andrea Chambers, who's been doing most of the heavy lifting on this work for the last couple of years, is going to take it now and walk you through an overview of both the methods and what we found today.
So we are going to be focusing on regional trends today. I had the opportunity to present part of this work before the holidays to the HSA Liaison Committee. In that presentation, we focused on part of the work that I'm going to show you today, but it was with one of our data sources. It was the work-related emergency department records. So for those of you who were at that presentation, today we're going to also show you what we've done to incorporate the lost time claims. So there'll be a bigger focus on the comparison between the two different data sources. And we've also done some work looking at injury severity as well. Okay, so we believe that really ongoing injury surveillance is, of course, really important for making decisions about priorities and targeting resources. And we feel that a lot of work can be done to improve surveillance in this area by working with our existing data sources. So our project and our analysis today really aligns with two different purposes. One is to we're supporting the implementation of the expert advisory panel's recommendations for enhanced surveillance of occupational injury. And one way that we thought about doing that and moving forward is using two different data sources, which do have their limitations independently, but by using them both, we can start to confirm some of the things that we're seeing. So there's also, as Ken mentioned, some ongoing work to examine the utility of a secondary data source, which is work-related emergency department records. A lot of work in health research has tended to rely on compensation claims, and that's really a great data source. For surveillance, however, there have been some concerns about the primary reliance on that data source. The concerns are really twofold, one being the integrity of workplace reporting of injury, and the second, the fact that some classes of workers are not covered by the compensation system, so we don't necessarily always get a full picture of the story. So I'll give you a little bit of background on our reason to focus on trends. Our first work that we did to compare the two different data sources, we looked over a 5-year period, and we saw a drop in claims of almost 18% between 2004 and 2008. And I think up until this point, a lot of us knew that claims were on the decline, but we weren't really sure if that might be an actual drop or an artifact of something else going on, such as changes in reporting. We found a parallel decline in our work-related emergency department records. So this was really a first stage in understanding the utility in having two different data sources to be able to confirm some of the things that we're seeing. So we really wanted to explore this decline further. And I think it's really important to look back, and we have made really great progress in the reduction of hazards in the workplace. These reductions that we're seeing, we can think about maybe two reasons. One being a tendency to target specific groups of workers that have had a high risk of injury, such as young workers. And as Curtis Breslin has shown, that particular population has had a lot of unique decline compared to other age groups. We've also been targeting specific types of injuries like musculoskeletal disorders. A lot of focus has been on that particular injury, which could be responsible for some of these declines. But really, this parallel decline that we're seeing in the two different data sources is evidence that the control of work hazards is improving in Ontario. So when we observe this decline, this about a 15% decline in ER records and about 18% in claims, we really wanted to know whether that decline would be observed across Ontario consistently and for all different types of work injuries. So the objective of our analysis that I'm going to show you today was just to describe rates of occupational injury in Ontario. And at this point, we were able to look over 7 years, so 2004 to 2010. And we wanted to look at economic region, injury events, and by injury severity. So some of you may have come to our plenary last year where we looked at work injury by time of day, a shift work study. At that presentation, we introduced a bit of background on these emergency department records and how we can use them for research in this field. So I'll provide a brief summary of what we're working with. This is one of the two data sources. It was really back in 2000 when Ontario mandated the reporting of all emergency department visits to this new system, the National Ambulatory Care Reporting System. So now we have these 5 million emergency department records every year to access, which is a really rich data source. But of course, in this field, we're not interested in all those records. We're interested in work injuries. So fortunately, we can extract work-related emergency department records because we have access to the responsibility for payment code. So in these emergency department records, that code gets assigned to the WSIB if it's a clinical determination that the incident was work-related. So that's really independent of a claim being filed and accepted for compensation. So it provides us with a really interesting portrait in these records. This is our period of observation, the 7 years. We're working with around 830,000 emergency department records that are work-related, with information to be able to establish the economic region. And this data source, a lot of great information we can get, of course, on gender and age, really good information on the outcome, the new problem, and the external cause. But I'll highlight a limitation with this particular data source for more refined analysis and other types of work and health research. We don't obviously have information on occupation and industry. So that may limit the sole use of emergency department records. We may always have to also be relying on compensation claims.
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
Just your second bullet there about the responsibility for the code. So the medical professional would have ascertained that that their organization was covered by WSIB?
No, just work-related.
Just if it's work-related.
So just to clarify, if WSIB did not end up paying for it, that field would still be full of that data.
Yeah. So it's really opening up a whole bunch of work injuries that we don't usually get to see with the claims data.
This is a piece of work. It's a piece of work we are hoping to do in the next 3 to 6 months, which is to do some fine-grained examination in 3 or 4 emergency departments about exactly how this clinical determination is made, how this mark gets put on the electronic records, the degree to which there might be an over-attribution or an under-attribution. There's a lot of work that we think we need to do here, in large measure because we think these are pretty promising data. So back to you.
Yeah. Great. So many of you would have seen and are maybe working with compensation claims data quite often. So I'll just provide a brief summary of this other data source that we can work with. Over our time period that we're going to be looking at, we have close to 560,000 lost time claim records with information to be able to establish the economic region. These are administrative records maintained by the Ontario Workplace Safety and Insurance Board. They contain information on the insured employer, and the course and outcome of individual claims. And so one part of the process, or the behind the scenes, is trying to establish and understand the two different coding systems that are used between emergency department records and claims. So we eventually established, for example, an injury event, 5 different levels of an injury event categories. And we were able to do that. The claims data use a national coding standard to establish the injury event. Emergency department records is based on the International Classification for Disease. Fortunately, when we do get to a high level of grouping, there's a lot of concordance between the two different data sources. 2 other data sources that we're using. So I'm going to be presenting rates today. Our emergency department rates, the denominator is based on employed persons, and we get that information from Stats Canada's Labour Force Survey. And for our rates with the claims data, that information is based on estimates of the insured labor force. So this is a diagram that Cam has presented previously at our presentation last year. I really like it because it's a really helpful way of thinking about these two different data sources and how they're related. Of course, there are going to be work injuries that don't end up in either of our data sources. They don't require an emergency department visit and they don't result in a claim. So we don't necessarily get that portrait, which is represented by this box here, D. And of course, there are going to be incidents that result in a claim being filed but never required emergency services, and vice versa as well. So in our analysis today, it's important to keep thinking that we're comparing essentially box A, lost time claims, with box E, our emergency department records. There's going to be some degree of overlap, but in each data source, we're looking at potentially unique incidents as well. And one thing we learned in some earlier work that we did, emergency department records, a higher proportion of those records are associated with contact and related injury event category, so a more immediate cause, something that would require emergency service, whereas a larger proportion of our claims data are associated with strains, something that requires more of an immediate accumulative exposure. So one of the main variables that we're going to look at today is economic region. And we're looking at 5 different regions in Ontario. These are established, the boundaries are established by the Ministry of Finance. And within them you have various census subdivisions, but today we're going to be looking at the north, the east, the GTA, southwest, and central. And what I've added here is the percent of employed persons within each region to give you a sense of how that's distributed. And I did this as well for the insured labor force, and the portrait looks very similar in terms of the distribution. So another thing that we've had to do is work with geographic region and how we're going to establish that in a common way using the 2 different data sources. So in our emergency department records, you get the first 3 digits of the patient's postal code, which I've learned is referred to as the forward sortation area. And now that is referring to the injured worker's home address. In our claims data, we have access to a 4-digit code that corresponds to where the accident occurred. So we have to assume that where the person is living and where their workplace is falls within the same economic region. And fortunately, we're dealing with very large areas. I think it would be more challenging if we were doing, for example, 46 regions, but because we're dealing with 5, in the majority of cases that will be correct, but I imagine in the more population-dense areas like the GTA and the connection between the southwest and central region, there might be more of a gray area. So going back to this slide again, because I'm going to be talking about trends over time, it's really hard to do that without first talking about the impact of the economic recession. So I had shown you before that over a 5-year period, we saw these declines of 15% and 18% in our 2 different data sources. In just 1 year, between 2008 and 2009 in Ontario, we had a decline of 17% and 18%. So we do have to keep that in mind. Obviously the economic recession had a huge impact on our work injuries, captured in both data sources. And I could say at this time as well that when you looked at employed persons in Ontario and the drop over that time period, it's only a drop of about 2.3%.
So you use 2004 to calculate that percentage drop, but the emergency room went up in 2005.
Yes, we just compare this count to this count, rather than taking everything in between.
But the percentage drop might have looked different if you'd used 2005 as the base year.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
So Kim had presented a presentation on and talked about the impact of the economic recession and the parallel decline in the two different data sources. And a really great question from the audience was, would this be the case if you looked at it by injury severity? Would you see a decline for both severe and less severe injuries? So I just wanted to share with you what we found. So we defined more severe injuries as concussion fractures, and then compared that to all other injuries. So we're looking at our 7 years of data here, the frequency, and then we have the percent change from the previous year. And so what we found between 2008 and 2009 are quite a similar decline for both severe and less severe injuries in our claims data. And we found a decline as well in both severe and less severe injuries with our emergency department records as well, with a slightly larger decline amongst the less severe injuries. But overall, our finding was that the economic recession did impact severe and less severe injuries, and that was evident in both data sources. So it was a good question. So I find, of course, the impact of the recession really, really interesting. There is an IWH issue briefing available online that goes into more details about it. But what I find particularly helpful about this particular issue briefing is that they present some ideas of potential explanations for the impact of the recession, some hypotheses of what we might be seeing a drop during the times of a recession. So I'll just briefly go over the 5 that were presented, just to keep in mind. One being fewer inexperienced workers on the job, least safe equipment being taken out of use, a pace of work may be slower, workers fearing job loss may defer the filing of claims as a potential idea, and hazardous industries may experience the largest decline in employment. So I'll move on to our most recent work that we've been doing. I'm going to be showing you a lot of data today, so I'm hoping to just sort of, rather than go through it all, just sort of draw your eyes to a few things that we found to be particularly interesting. But I thought I'd start with just a high-level summary of our main findings, and I'll show you some of the data. So first, there appears to be very little variation in the rate of claims across the 5 economic regions. But there is a lot more variation when we look at our emergency department records. We've been seeing a larger decline in the claims compared to emergency department records over the 7-year period. Another thing that we've found with respect to injury severity is that the decline in the incidence of more severe injuries parallels the decline in less serious injuries, and that's the case for both data sources. We have also had the opportunity to look at injury event, and it's really falls that really stands out as being a bit different than the other injury event categories. The reduction over time in injuries with falls has been less substantial than other causes. And lastly, of course, we've also been looking at economic region. And it's really the north that stands out as having the highest overall rate of injury and the highest rate of more severe injury. So what I'm showing you here is our most recent year of data that we have access to, which is 2010. And we're just looking at rates per 1,000 employed persons. Here I just have the frequency, employed persons, and the rate, and we have it for emergency department records and lost time claims. So you can see over here amongst the claims data, very little variation in the rate across the economic regions. But when we look at emergency department record, we see a lot more variation here, particularly high in the north. In this second slide, you're going to see this as well, but looking at trends over time. And we have two portraits here. We have emergency department records and then lost time claims. And then I have the 7 years of data. And on the y-axis here is the rate of injury per 1,000. And you can see very clearly, like, not much variation amongst our claims data and a lot of variation over time with our emergency department records. And this up here, this is corresponding to the North region. And down here, this is the GTA. And so really the rate is almost 3 times higher. So Pam and I have found this to be very interesting, this difference between the two different data sources. And what we've been talking about most at this time is the potential variation in access to health services across the 5 regions. For those of us who live in the GTA, you know that if you do need urgent care, you have options. For example, you can go to a walk-in clinic. There's lots of options out there. Whereas in the north, you may not have as much options for dealing with an urgent care need, and thus ending up in the emergency department. And really, this portrait, I guess, highlights one of the limitations in using health services data, is that you do have to take in consideration variation in access to care when you're looking across the economic regions. This is a bit of a busy slide. One thing that we've been finding is really helpful is rather than looking over the 7 years initially, we break it down into 2 3-year periods so that we can see what was happening before the recession, so between 2004 and 2007, and then we can look for the next 3 years, 2007 through to 2010, to get a sense of the difference. And overall, we do see a larger decline happening in these last 3 years, with some exceptions, particularly the East Economic Region here for the emergency department records. So this is the percent relative decline based on the rates between 2004 and 2007, and then 2007 through 2010. And the one thing I'll highlight here is in the north, really a much lower decline in injuries over both periods of data. However, that wasn't necessarily the case with the claims. In the north, we had a drop of almost 30% during this period and close to 12% between 2004 and 2007. So it's also kind of neat to see a full portrait for the 7 years to see really the dramatic decline. We have, of course, made great progress across Ontario, a 30% decline and almost 40% amongst claims. But I just highlight, when we are doing the comparison between the two data sources, we're seeing a lot of differences in the north. So for example here, a much smaller decline amongst emergency department records and a lot larger decline in the claims data. And that seemed to be consistent in finding a lot of difference in that particular region. We've also been looking at injury severity, and so of course we've been defining more severe injuries as concussion and fractures and comparing it to all other injuries. So we're looking at rates per 1,000 employed persons. We're looking at the emergency department records and the lost time claims, and by economic region. And I'll point out two things here. One is that overall, our rates are quite similar between the two different data sources when we look at more severe injuries. But in both data sources, again in the north, kind of standing out as having the highest rate of more severe and less severe injury in both data sources. Now we can also look over time, again looking at 2004 to 2007, to get a sense of how things are declining. Really, in the lost time claims in Ontario, it's quite similar between the two different levels of severity, but what was particularly interesting amongst the more severe injuries amongst the emergency department records is quite consistent drop across these regions, but in every case the north was not doing as well, but it seemed to have had quite a large, not that much larger, but a large decline in more severe injuries over this time period. But that was sort of opposite when we looked at the claims data. And then for some reason in 2007 through 2010, we actually saw some increases in severe injuries showing up in the emergency department record. Emergency department, a 6.4% increase in the east, an increase in the Southwest, and we saw a large increase in emergency department records for concussion and fractures. And that was not the case. It wasn't captured in our claims data. Now this is a very busy slide, so I'm just going to point you to a few things. Once we started looking at injury event, you just get a lot of data, especially when you're also looking at our economic region. So these are our injury event categories. Strain-related injuries, contact with objects or equipment, falls, exposure to harmful substances, and other. Other includes transportation accidents, assaults and violence, and fire and explosions. When we get down to that level, there isn't a lot of data to be able to do this kind of comparison. But what I'll point you to here is that overall, larger declines in this time period across all the different injury events, with the exception of exposures, wasn't impacted as much during that period of the recession. Another thing I'll point out is with falls, our rates weren't necessarily going down as much, either with strain-related injuries, but we had significant gains for falls and strains over the period 2007 to 2010. Now I have two more slides of data, one for emergency department records, one for claims, to give you an overall portrait of where we are at. So when we look again at the emergency department records, a lot more variation here in our rate, but really high in the north, 36.7. And then when we look across the injury event categories, it's really high for all of the 5 different categories of injury event. And in the north, looking at the claims data, also highest, but not for all injury events. And so at this point, there isn't a lot of difference here in the rates, so we do need to integrate some confidence intervals to start being able to say something a bit more concrete.
Sorry, can you go back and forth? What's the difference between these two?
Sorry, emergency?
Yeah.
Claims. Okay, but yeah. Yeah, so in our claims data, we did see a lot less variation. Yeah. So just to summarize sort of what we've seen, these work injuries captured in both claims and emergency department records. We've seen major declines over a 7-year period, which is really great news. And we'd like to understand that some more. Of course, the recession resulted in a dramatic decline in work injuries captured in both data sources. And I think we can all agree by looking at the rates that although there has been significant progress, rates of injury are still high, and they are varying to some extent by region and injury event. When we looked at the various economic region, it was really the north that stood out as having the highest rate of both overall occupational injury, but also more severe injury. There was a bit less variation, though, when we looked at the claims data, so we need to look at that a bit further. And really, to some extent, the two different data sources may be capturing different types of occupational injuries, and that's something that we would really like to understand further, which really sort of leads into our next steps. We're getting started on doing a linkage between the two different data sources to understand how the level of concordance, which is going to tell us a lot about the validity of this new data system, the National Ambulatory Care Reporting System, as a source of data for surveillance in this field.
So about halfway through the presentation, Andrea put up a graph, 2 graphs, one in which on the left side was the trend over time in the rate of emergency department visits by 5 regions, and there's quite wide variation. Mm-hmm. And on the right side, the same portrait over time for lost time claims, in which the differences between region were detectable, but not nearly as dramatic. Right? So if we think about that right-hand slide, how many of us in the room would have predicted that that's what we would have seen when we estimated the insured labor force by each of the 5 regions for the denominator, placed on the numerator the registered lost time claims, and computed the rate, given that employment by industry is quite different across the sector. So what this is saying is that 6% of people in the north are in the resource sector, compared to, let's say, the Southwest, where less than 1%. Or, down here, manufacturing, 15% of the Ontario population labor force is in manufacturing, quite high concentration in the southwest, almost 20%, versus less than 10% in the north. So that graph on the right side was not adjusted for industry mix. It was just a straight, crude estimate, and it said not much difference.
And that was all claims, all lost time claims.
Last time claims.
So then might it reflect that in the southwest you're getting more soft tissue sprain strains, as opposed to what I'm thinking you're thinking is that you're picking up the injuries associated with resource sector that might be more.
Yeah, good point. So if we looked at a more refined level about injuries that would be associated with repetitive motion in manufacturing versus injuries associated with
Falls.
more traumatic
Big
causes.
accidents.
Yeah.
Although I was under the impression that if it was a musculoskeletal injury, if you didn't get the person back very quickly, then depression set in. So that could have a factor depending on what the injury was, I think.
But I think our expectation was that the regional differences in the incidence of lost time claims would be more dramatic than what we saw.
So yeah, I was wondering about that as this was being presented, Cam, and what's striking for me is because of the resource sector intensity in the north, but the manufacturing being so much lower in the north, are manufacturing claim rates usually higher than the average? Do we know that?
They'll be above the median.
Yeah, so I wonder if there's some offsetting things going on here, right? On the one hand, you expect the mining to bring you to a higher claim rate, but the manufacturing, maybe that dampens it. Still doesn't explain what you're seeing in the emergency department records.
I think your point's well taken. I really appreciate it when you're saying that it could be an access issue, because I know a lot of the communities in the north, anecdotally, that's your point of care. There's no other point. So if you have back pain, you go to Emerge. If you have a sore wrist, you go to Emerge. We have many other things. We go to our GP first.
Yeah.
So that'd be interesting to try and tease apart.
Yvonne?
So this is about incident cases, but in the emergency department cases, how do you account for the fact that there might be
There is a code in the NACR's record that indicates whether it's a return or follow-up visit or an initial visit. Right, Melanie? Yeah. And so we've extracted as best the ER staff are aware, the incident visit, the first visit. Yes, sorry.
Thank you. I remember, Pam, when you first introduced some of these data, and we have all these questions, and it's nice to see the answers. It raises more questions again. But I just wanted to talk about the plans going forward, focus on accuracy between emergency rooms and workers' comp. And I see a nice quantitative study that you're planning, but I see a beautiful qualitative study that would focus on if you could study how and when people do record keeping in emergency rooms, you could find out that, well, if they come in the night versus the day, they'll be different, or depending on which intake person does it, it might be different. And so you could see the logic of the reporting, which would be another issue over and above accuracy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I do think personally that there's enough indication of real value in the emergency department records, even though they are absent information on industry and occupation, that we need to learn more about what goes on when a work-related episode presents to an emergency department. What goes on in terms of the process by which it gets attributed to being work-related? How accurate is it? Is it 9 times out of 10? And what is exactly the
and
process?
Which ones fit through, which ones don't? Yeah, with a bunch of
Yeah. Lynn?
So 2 points related to that. So I think it's a really useful kind of thing to pursue. So back in my WSIB days, one of the things that I had responsibility for was the periodic comparison between the Ministry of Health and the WSIB of claims, where there was actually a very protracted, painful process where so many OHIP claims were selected, so many WSIB claims were selected. You sat down, you looked at kind of did they actually match up or not? Were they coded correctly? And then based on the results of that, money would flow from the ministry to the WSIB or vice versa, because in fact it related to where the kind of cost was attributed to. So I don't know whether they still do that.
Good question.
But certainly 10 years ago it was being done. So that's kind of one piece. And certainly there was discrepancy. So kind of that's point one. I think the kind of the next step in this, I would really be interested in that next step of looking more closely, because I mean, billing practice is interesting. So I mean, I actually bill. I bill in a different setting, but I mean, I do the billing, so I'm responsible for how that coding's done. So I think, you know, it would be really interesting to know emergency department by emergency department. Is the individual physician billing? Is it done by their central billing office? Does the hospital have some involvement? Because all of those things kind of may be different by region, by hospital, and though they'd be really important things to know. So.
Well,
So I think that's a really good next step.
Glad to hear. Glad to hear.
It's interesting, when I'm doing my billing, I always reflect on now, am I really accurately for, what if somebody's using my data as
Emil.
This is probably way down the road, but it's very interesting to see the magnitude of the decline that you see over that time period you're looking at, because the economy didn't go down that much, right?
No.
So if you could break it down, like you'd have to use other data from, I guess, industry to see what changes are happening within industry in terms of reductions in staffing versus reductions in capacity and various stuff like that, to figure out, or technological changes that are also happening as well, to figure out how that breaks up into different dynamics that are happening in the workplace.
Yeah, so I mean, the good news in many ways is that the global financial crisis, its impact on the Canadian economy and those of us who work in the economy was relatively mild compared to other economies. It was shorter and it wasn't as deep, and it's sort of past in the sense that employment is increasing, people are going back to work, hours of work at the labor force level are back and above where they were before. So in a sense, it's a bit of a historical artifact. And yet, there's something really important about what happened there, which is that, as Andrea said, the hours of work overall only went down by about 2.5%. The incidence of work-related injury and illness reported in both data sources went down 20%. So the exposure time, hours of work, would have predicted a reduction in injuries of about 2 to 3 to 4%. It's much more than that. Now, part of it is there's a sectoral pattern to it. So the hours of work in construction went down 10%. The injuries and illness in construction in Ontario went down 20%. The hours of work in healthcare during the recession went up 1%. The incidence of injury and illness in healthcare in that year, 2008-2009, went down by 5%. Okay? So you're absolutely right. There's that dynamic. One of the things we don't know about in typical sources of information about working condition, we know lots about hours of work. We don't know about the intensity of work. We don't know how hard people were working. We don't, which is, in many ways, I think, where the risk. One of the things I think we can take away from the recession is that although payroll hours didn't drop as much as we might have expected, we can be pretty confident that the intensity at which people were working went down.
To a certain degree, but the output hasn't gone down. So the intensity must not have gone down.
It's a weird world, isn't it? Good.
But wasn't there an attitudinal change? Higher premiums from WSIB. I think there was a big attitudinal change that manufacturers in particular had to pay more attention to health and safety.
And that's been, I think, continuous over the past decade. Absolutely. Absolutely. I did hear, just in terms of an example of how the intensity of work may have changed, talking to a manufacturer who operated 3 or 4 sites in Ontario, told the story of a facility that was running a day shift and an evening shift. And as they went into the recession, the demand for their product dropped such that they closed the evening shift, maintained payroll. They didn't lay anybody off. They maintained payroll. They took the evening shift right? Which, as we've been, I think, documenting, working evenings and nights has an inherently higher risk per hour worked than working during the day. So there's just one little anecdote of how the recession influenced in that company the way in which hours of work didn't really change, but the nature of work was intensely affected. Any questions from our ministry colleagues? Any comments?
I was thinking about whether or not there might be other sources of data that you could draw on, and one of the things that we've been talking about is also pharmaceutical prescriptions. So whether that's a source of data you could tap into in terms of what pharmacies are prescribing or dispensing, which doctors are prescribing for work-related injuries. I'm not sure how you access that data. I know that WSIB has done some analysis on that, particularly around like OxyContin prescriptions, for example, for traumatic injuries.
Ontario doesn't, like in British Columbia, they have a lovely PharmaNet database which tracks every prescription that goes out, right? We don't have a similar resource in Ontario that does that for all pharmaceutical prescriptions. And we suspect that what the WSIB pays for is probably only a small proportion of what's
actually the sample. Yeah. We've also struggled just with the postal code of the worker in terms of asking, are we looking for where they work or for where they are living, residing, and would there be, if they're commuting to where they're working, would there be that discrepancy between the economic regions, and also if they're working more than one job, and potentially traveling as a tradesperson to multiple locations, are we going to accurately capture where the injuries are taking place? So it's a challenge.
Mm-hmm. Any additional questions? Go ahead.
I'm wondering, why we didn't use standardization for the rates for the geographical variation and the trends, because I'm not sure, but is it possible that the insured people will have more homogeneity than the general labor force, so that we observe more distribution with the ED visit than the WSIB? So maybe a simple standardization by distribution.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. It is the case in Ontario that about 3 out of every 10 people who are working are not working in an employment arrangement that provides them coverage by the WSIB. And our anticipation was that the insured labor force would actually not be a constant fraction of the labor force across the 5 economic regions. That in the GTA, for example, where there's a concentration of employment in the financial services sector, the banking, insurance industry, which is not an insured sector, that we perhaps see a lower proportion of the labor force in the GTA insured compared to, say the East region. It turns out that, as Andrea mentioned, that the insured population, insured labor force, is a pretty constant proportion across the 5 economic regions. But I do think that there is some value in doing some standardization for industry mix.
Can you talk about how you're planning to match the data sets in terms of the concordance between the ER visits and
we're doing it in 2 steps, just because we have to address the data custodians' concerns. The first step is to simply estimate with what. Let me back up a second and do it this way. If using actually a limited number of variables, not including name, so age, years, gender, date of the injury, and geography? Yeah, and geography. Using those limited number of variables, we're fairly confident that if we take the 2 data sources and classify each record into a age, gender, date of injury, geography bin, that we'll find one record in each data set. That's what we're going to do first, is just test the degree to which these anticipated linkage variables are actually able to segregate both data sets into unique record in each bin. Once we've got that done, and we're optimistic that we'll find that there's great promise here, then we need to go back to the data custodians and arrange the approvals to allow us to actually link the records. And when we link the records, then we'll be able to do some more sophisticated analysis. As Andrea said quite early in the presentation, we fully expect that there are a significant share of emergency department visits that do not result in a lost time claim. Similarly, there are probably 50% of lost time visits that do not present to an emergency department. But the lost time claims that do present to an emergency department visit is a terrific opportunity to look at concordance in the two data sources, and also in the two groups which are not concordant, to understand more about them as well. So we'll probably be 6 to 8 months on that work.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
So would you consider adding the no lost time claims in there to get a more,
Yeah. Wouldn't you?
Okay. Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you all very much. Any last questions? Thanks for coming. We don't have enough umbrellas to send off your all of our visitors today.